Right. So, Dr. Tallis, again, thank you for giving your generous time and for accepting this invitation for this conversation. Um, I mean, talking about you, discussing with you, it's really it really. I mean, the question is not what to talk about, but what not to talk about, because in your work, I mean, your wide range of intellectual industry, I mean, spans, I mean, all of these areas, and it's really important, but to specify a certain topic, otherwise we won't be getting anywhere with anything. So
Of course.
yeah.
Well, let me say I'm delighted to be here, and it's a special pleasure to meet that rare thing, a doctor who is also interested in philosophy.
But I'm sure, I mean, you must have met quite a few people such, I mean, of those interests, definitely. I mean, I mean, they might have reached out to you, certainly.
Perhaps, but actually, not many doctors are interested in philosophy, not in the way that we're interested in digging into the deeper questions. Of
Yeah.
course, they're interested in philosophy as it comes at them in problems of medical ethics and so on and so forth. But when it comes to metaphysics or epistemology, all the things that I certainly enjoy, I don't
Mhm.
think it's got much of a readership amongst the medical profession. Not in the UK anyway.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So recently, just 2 days back, I had a conversation with Jacob Stegenga, who's working in the philosophy of medicine department in the University of Cambridge.
Right.
Uh, so again, I mean, that becomes a very technical kind of enterprise, philosophy of science or philosophy of medicine. It's more of applied philosophy, mm, and less about metaphysics or the bigger questions. Definitely, I mean, that's also important in its own right.
Certainly, yes. I mean, there are aspects of the philosophy of medicine that go a little bit deeper into philosophy. So, example, what is a disease? Is it a natural kind?
Yeah.
How, in what sense are we embodied? In what sense are we identical with the illnesses that affect our body? How do we translate illnesses that have a physiological basis into narratives of personal experience? All of those things actually get us quite close to some central philosophical problems. But you're quite right. Most people who are interested in the philosophy of medicine tend to focus on medical ethics. Yeah.
So I suppose we can, I mean, straight away we can start with the main area of your own, intellectual concern that has been for quite a number of years. Your own background from neuroscience, obviously, and also your own philosophical interest in the field and your work over there in the philosophy of mind, especially. Um, so Neuromania and Darwinitis. I mean, this is the subtitle of your book, Aping Mankind. Those from the medical profession would be aware that, I mean, Darwinitis. I mean, it's an inflammation of the Darwinian model, or
Yes.
something gone wrong over there. Yeah. So you use such terms. I noticed. I mean, even theoria, which sounds I mean, awfully similar to diarrhea, or
It does, absolutely. Well, perhaps it's worthwhile going back. I mean, we can come to neuromania and
yeah, sure.
Darwinitis in a minute, and we can discuss the difference between Darwinism and Darwinitis and between neuromania and neuroscience. My interest in philosophy really goes a very long way back. It probably goes back to when I was a student at Oxford. And one of the things I remember was having very good conversations with my infinitely patient tutor at Oxford. I did a physiology degree before I did medicine, as you had to do at Oxford, and I've focused very much on neurophysiology. And one of the discussions we had is the extent to which understanding the brain would advance our understanding of what it is to be a human being. And so Roy Kay, who was my lovely tutor, he and I used to argue as to whether or not mental phenomenon and all those kinds of things were identical with brain activity. And I've thought about that conversation on and off for, well, 50 odd years. And this brings us to the difference between neuroscience, which is a very, very great cognitive achievement. It brings together many other sciences. And I was at Oxford at the time when they were first discovering or getting to understand the very nature of synapses and so on. So you can understand how exciting it was there. And that's neuroscience, very respectful and so on. The difference between neuroscience and neuromania is that neuroscience basically understands that having a brain in some kind of working order is a necessary condition of everyday life. Neuromania says, actually, what you are a brain. And actually being a brain in some kind of working order is what it is to be a human being. And so for me, the difference between neuroscience and neuromania is that neuroscience recognizes that the brain is a necessary condition of daily life. You know, if you chop my head off, my IQ falls quite precipitously.
Yeah.
Neuromania says essentially that the brain is not only a necessary, but a sufficient condition of daily life, ordinary consciousness, and so on. So the way to understand what it is to be a human being is to peer with more and more clever instruments into the intracranial darkness, into the darkness inside our skull. So that's neuromania and neuroscience. Now, you mentioned Darwinitis, and quite correctly, you picked up this is an inflamed state of Darwinism. And Darwinism, of course, is a fantastic theory. It's fantastic for all sorts of reasons. The first is its scope, its amazing scope. But the other is that it was put forward in 1859, and it's been tested against all sorts of discoveries and technologies that Darwin himself could not imagine. For example, carbon dating, filling in the fossil record, continental drift, all of these things, genetics. And basically, Darwinism has looked more and more robust. So what does Darwinism tell us? Darwinism tells us how the organism, H. sapiens, came into being. What it doesn't tell us is what a person is. People who think that Darwinism tells you what a person is basically suffer from this terrible intellectual condition called Darwinitis. So those are the two intellectual diseases, if you like, that have preoccupied me. And they're important because they fit into a bigger preoccupation that perhaps we'll come to, the preoccupation of someone who's a humanist.
Sure. Yeah. So coming back to neuromania, certainly if you look at popular culture and the kind of neuromythology that is popular uh, amongst popular science fiction, for example. There's all this talk about again transhumanism as well. This virtual immortality, when the
Yeah,
mind being transferred into your brain and sorry, mind being transferred into a machine or a computer, and then you're able to basically you're able to upload your software into another hardware, into
yeah.
another. This kind of language is pervasive. In modern popular culture.
It
Uh,
certainly is, yes. And in fact, you're sort of picking up on some of the consequences of neuromania. Perhaps we could divide them into basically those consequences that have given rise to so-called disciplines that are prefixed by neuro. So,
mm,
taking the general point, if you want to understand about human beings, you peer into their brain. So, there is Neuro Aesthetics that says if you really want to understand basically how we experience art, then you stimulate subjects with exposure to art and look at what happens to their brains when you're looking at a MRI scan or whatever. There is neuroeconomics, which basically explains our economic decisions by means of the propensities of our brain. There's neuro law that says our propensity to commit crimes depends on the balance between the activity in different parts of the brain, between the frontal lobe that says don't do it, and the amygdaloid body which says, oh, I want to do it. So these kind of grotesque simplifications are very important aspects of human life, aspects that are unique to human beings. There's one spin-off of a very deplorable spin-off from neuromania. But there is also a very complicated set of ideas about what does it mean if we are our brains? Well, if we are our brains, then our minds, we are told, are identical with neural activity. Sensations, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, all of these are neural activity in different senses. Well, for all sorts of reasons, that isn't the case. But one of the problems that arises out of that is saying, well, in what sense is neural activity identical with, for example, the emotion of fear or whatever. In what sense is it identical with thought? And for some neuromaniacs, they say, well, of course, the brain or the mind and the person isn't identical with the wetware of the brain, the sort of material, the grey blobs of porridge inside the skull. No, what the mind is, it is essentially the software in the brain. And so we have this notion of the mind essentially being the computational activity of the brain. And that doesn't work for all sorts of things. Not the least is we know of no computers yet that are conscious. The computer's achieving amazing things. Many of you will have heard, or you will have heard of, say, AlphaGo, which is able to beat world champions at this most complicated game called Go. But of course, the computers aren't playing Go. They're just prostheses for people who are using the computers to play the game. The computer doesn't make its way to the place where the game takes place, has no idea of what it's doing, and has no sense of victory at the end. But you can see how if you reduce persons and minds to brains, and you reduce or you look at the brain through the lens of computational science, there is a kind of claim that essentially a human being or a human person is the activity of the software in the wetware of the brain. And that really brings us to something you referred to in passing, which is about transhumanism. Because just as you can copy the information in a computer endlessly, supposing what's in the brain that makes up me is information. Well, we can copy this endlessly. And better still, we'll copy it onto something that doesn't rot. Why not copy it on, instead of this wretched rotting body we have, why don't we copy the information in our brain onto some kind of medium that doesn't rot? So there is this notion that we could potentially replicate ourselves, store ourselves, protect ourselves against the rot of being biological organisms and live forever. There are one or two problems straight away you can see with that. Supposing we had 10 copies of me straight away, which one would be me, and all that sort of thing? Of course, the answer is none of them would be me, because I am not the software of the wetware of my brain. And by the way, I'm not reduced to information. Information is a higher order form of consciousness. At least, rather, it's what emerges when conscious beings start articulating their conscious experiences. And to try and reduce consciousness or people to information is to turn things upside down.
Well, I'd really like to know to really discuss some of these arguments that you use. I mean, for example, when you attack materialism, the popular kind of model to explain consciousness.
Yes.
But before we go there, I mean, just in passing, could you also comment on, for example, when you're speaking about machines and the mind being similar to a computer, the popularly used term is artificial intelligence. So
Yes.
I mean, would you be more forgiving of this term intelligence rather than consciousness, for example?
Oh, that's a good question. The answer is no. It
Yeah,
seems to me that real intelligence has as its ground floor consciousness. It's built on consciousness.
yeah,
Um, Basically, there are machines that can be useful prostheses for helping us to behave intelligently, to make intelligent predictions, to discover things, and so on. But the machines themselves are not intelligent. They are basic because they're unconscious. And we have to remember that everybody accepts them. Computers are unconscious. Everybody knows that a computer with 50 billion teraflops of RAM is just as unconscious as my pocket calculator. Nobody, I think, has ascribed consciousness to computers. And they know that just by getting more complicated alternative architectures, increased power, we won't get anywhere near to consciousness. And it's probably a good idea to think why that is the case. And it brings us to something you've just referred to, which is the materialist viewpoint, in which tries to say there is only matter, there are only physical events, physical objects, physical stuff. And consciousness is some kind of expression of physical stuff. It is no different fundamentally from physical stuff. And it's good to sort of test that idea against something pretty basic. Let's think of perception. I can see you now. And there's certainly one aspect of perception that seems to fit in with a very clear-cut materialist view of the world. Why can I see you? Basically because there's light bouncing off your head and it crosses the space between us. It enters my eyes, tickles up my retina, goes down my visual pathways, and tickles up my visual cortex. That is straightforward causal chain of events. And philosophers and many scientists, including my dear tutor, Roy Kay, felt that that explained consciousness or explained perception. Basically, it was about light coming into my brain and tickling up my visual cortex, the area involved with seeing. But hang on a moment. That's not the end of the story. That's how the light gets in. But something else happens. The gaze looks out and it locates you, for example, as over there and away from me. Now, that gaze isn't explained by the causal pathway. There's almost a sense in which the gaze points the other way. So when I'm looking and seeing you, what I'm actually seeing are events that are causally upstream, that are earlier than what's happening in my visual cortex. So basically, the causal theory of perception or the materialist theory of perception, materialist theory of mind, basically can explain, for example, how the light gets in and tickles up my brain, but it doesn't explain how the gaze looks out. It doesn't explain something that's absolutely central to our current understanding of the mind in philosophy, something called intentionality. And I don't know whether that's a term that you're familiar with.
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
And it's translated usually, and I think quite well, as aboutness. So
Mm.
whatever's happening in my visual cortex, if that were the basis of my seeing you, that neural activity would have to be somehow about you, and in particular about your face, which I can see now. And that aboutness is not seen anywhere else in nature. It's not seen, basically, in most of the nervous system. It's not seen in the spinal cord, the cerebellum, the vast part of the cerebral cortex that isn't associated with consciousness. So basically, it seems very difficult to accept that there's something about particular areas in the cerebral cortex that are so totally different from everything else in material nature, that they have this property of, such as the activity that takes place in them is about something other than themselves. Well, that aboutness, I have to say, couldn't seem to be terribly explained by neural activity, by sodium and potassium ions going through flea-bitten membranes. It doesn't seem to do it for me. No.
Yeah, and in this context, you also cite the German philosopher Heidegger,
Yes,
that uh, we are not just intertwined in this causal, in this mechanistic or causal chain, but we are, or in the mechanistic world, but we're actually able to look back at it, to peer at it. I mean, from our own point of view. I mean, the first person point of view again. Uh,
absolutely. And you've picked up two absolutely central things. The first one is very much Heideggerian, which
yeah,
is that we are creatures who face the world. We don't merely interact in it, with
yeah,
it. So, in other words, I'm not merely interacting with the light coming from your head. I'm actually now looking back at you as you are to me. So, we are creatures who face the world and make it our world, a world that matters to us. It's about our being, human being as a being whose being is an issue for itself. And that issue is played out in a world that we face. I think that's very important. And Heidegger doesn't talk much about this, but you're quite right. The other thing that's missing in a materialist account is first person being, the sense of the I that relates to the it and to the you and to the other.
Um, before we deal more about the first person point of view, could you talk about intentionality itself? And I mean, for example, I mean these uh, intentionality is one aspect, and the other is of course qualia as well. The
Yes,
feeling of what it is like. And for example, seeing the color red. I mean, there
yes,
won't be any scientific description corresponding to the actual experience of seeing the color
yeah.
red. You can describe the wavelength of the color red, but it doesn't correspond to the, or it doesn't translate exactly into the experience. So what
You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, what I'm interested in, sorry, is also
You told.
to know from you what you think are some really strong objections against your argument that you're making over here.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
for
mean,
example,
fine. Should we deal first of all with qualia and with uh,
certainly.
first of all, I gave you an example of perception, my seeing your face. Um, that's a little bit more upmarket, shall we say, than sensation, which is, say, merely seeing a color or feeling an itch or feeling a pain or wet or seeing a flash. Now, a lot of people said those kinds of basic elementary qualia, the feeling of things, the sense of things, the smell of coffee, and so on, that they are don't have intentionality. I think they do, actually. I think they're always located in an object which is out there, which is an intentional object of my consciousness. So that's it's a very important feature of consciousness in an irreducible point. Now you had there was a second part to your question. Do you know I've forgotten what it was?
Yeah. So, what do you think are strong objections from the
Ah,
materialist
yes,
or the naturalist camp?
yes, of course. Well, I think there are some strong objections, and one comes, for example, from brain damage. All my research was in stroke and epilepsy, and I've seen the very close correlation between deficits in people's functioning, deficits in aspects of consciousness, and so on and so forth, which correspond quite closely, not very closely, but quite closely to damage to the brain. So people would say, well, there you are. It's clear that if you lose consciousness when you lose your brain, the brain must have been the seat of consciousness. End of story. And I would say no, it means the brain is a necessary condition for consciousness, but it isn't the whole story. And we'll come perhaps a little bit further to the whole story in due course. But people might say, well, hang on a moment. Will you remember those experiments of Wilder Penfield, the great neurosurgeon, Canadian neurosurgeon? Just to explain to the listeners who are not familiar with his research, he was one of the pioneers of surgery for epilepsy. And the idea was you'd cut out the bit of the brain which was thought to be the source of the abnormal activity that caused the epileptic fit. But of course, it was very important not to cut out bits of the brain that were central for activities such as speech, memory, and so on and so forth. So he did his operations on waking subjects. The brain doesn't have any sensation itself. So he did the operations on waking subjects. And what he did was he stimulated bits of the brain to find out which bits were really important so he wouldn't cut those out and leave the person seriously disabled. And what he found, and subsequent neurosurgeons have found the same, is you can stimulate bits of the brain and get quite complicated experiences or even memories. There's one very important example of a person who had, when a particular part of the brain was stimulated, had clear memories of a childhood experience when the circus came to town. So people say, okay, that's clear that if you can stimulate the brain and get a complex experience like that, then the brain must not only be a necessary condition of consciousness, but also a sufficient condition. Not so fast, for two reasons. Firstly, that person had already had the experience in the normal way. So, if you like, you were drawing on an experience that already existed. But the other is, these studies were done in people who are awake. In other words, the consciousness was already being served up by the patient, and it was just being modified by the stimulation. So you can see how the people may feel, gosh, isn't there strong evidence that the brain is the base of consciousness from the effects of brain damage and from the effects of brain stimulation? But I hope I persuaded you that neither of those things are decisive. Neither of those things show us that we are identical with our brains. I always think of the brain as, if you like, the ground floor from which we spring off and live. And one very important aspect of that springing off brings us back to intentionality. I wrote a book on pointing, and do you have any children by any chance?
No, no, not over here right now. Yeah.
Not yet. But one of the things, the lovely things you see when children are very young, up to about 10 months, they start pointing at things. This is even before they can speak. And this is a way of sharing experience. They acknowledge that there's a world we have in common. This is very early on. It's a human universal, but it's unique to humans. Chimpanzees, for example, or higher primates, sometimes do some kind of pointing activity in captivity, never in the wild. But what they do in captivity is not the sort of thing that a 10-month-old is doing. When a 10-month-old is pointing at things, he wants to share them with you. When a primate in captivity points at something, it's what they call imperative pointing. It really wants to grab something. But what that 10-month-old is doing is sharing her or his experience. And it seems to me that one of the most fundamental aspects of humanity and human consciousness is the sharing of experience. It's what the philosophers call joined intentionality. And basically, our human minds are woven out of billions and billions of cognitive handshakes, beginning with pointing and then continuing with things we share through language. And that's where our humanity is to be found, not in the organism or the organ of the brain, but in what the brain has then permitted us to do. Here's a metaphor to illustrate the difference. We know that trees grow out of acorns. And if you plant hundreds and hundreds of acorns, you'll eventually get a wood. And when the wind blows, you can hear the whispering of the wind in the trees. Now, those of us who think, or those who think that they can see what it is to be a human being by peering into the brain, are a bit like people who put a stethoscope to an acorn, hoping to hear the whispering of the woods. And of course you won't, because there isn't that intentionality, that joined intentionality that human beings have, that creates the community of minds, the institutions and so on in which we live.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. The last metaphor that you've given,
Thank you.
it really begs the question: Is this doesn't this sound like that you're saying that the mind could be an epiphenomenon of the brain in that sense? Doesn't this metaphor, give suggestion to that idea?
Well, if it were an epiphenomenon, well, it doesn't make it any easier to explain why it should arise in particular neurons. I mean, if you think about it, there's no epiphenomenal consciousness in the spinal cord. There's none in the cerebellum. There's none in the midbrain, or, well, perhaps, who knows, but there's none in the vast majority of the cortex. And it's almost as if neural activity has to travel in order, as it were, to become conscious. And that looks very odd, doesn't it? You know, we say that travel broadens the mind, but it's very odd if travel broadened into a mind, wouldn't it? So I don't think the appeal, all the use of the word epiphenomenal or epiphenomenon does is actually to take any power out of consciousness. If you remember, or you may remember, Thomas Huxley, who was a great supporter of Darwin, said that in many ways consciousness didn't seem to have a part to play in the evolution and function of the organism. It was just like the whistle on the train. It contributed nothing to the chuff, 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 chuff of going. And I think if consciousness was epiphenomenal in this way, in the sense of having no causal power, then I think it would be even more difficult rather than less difficult to explain. It would certainly be very difficult to explain in evolutionary terms, because what's the point of an epiphenomenon?
Yeah. What do you mean when you say that it has no causal power? I mean, could it be that it is an epiphenomenon and still affect the causal chain of material events, for example? Um,
Well, by definition, an epiphenomenon is one that doesn't have causal power. That's a sort of the standard interpretation. That is to say, it's just like the sparkling on the waves or whatever. It doesn't do anything to move the sea around. That's the
mm,
fundamental definition of the notion of an epiphenomenon.
yeah.
So it makes it more difficult rather than less difficult to understand. So if you were going to understand consciousness in evolutionary terms, it had really better do something useful for the organism. And that's a really puzzling thing. What use is consciousness? Um, Basically, if you're serious about survival, you're serious about replication. And if you're serious about replication, you want mechanisms that are absolutely reliable. And those mechanisms are the laws of nature. Anything other than the laws of nature, say consciousness with wondering if and perhaps and but, really doesn't add to the slickness of the replication of the organism. What's more, even if it was useful, consciousness, it basically, what actually produced it out of unconscious organisms? And the answer is there's clearly no process by which consciousness can be generated in this way. We lack a good Darwinian explanation of consciousness. I mean, if you think about the things that can be achieved without consciousness, it's quite embarrassing how little consciousness achieves. Let me take one example. Your brain, it grew itself in utero without anything or anybody telling it what to do. Your brain is the most complex object in the universe. So if you can put together the most complex object in the universe by pure mechanism, why bother with something as clumsy and as incompetent as consciousness? It seems to me that a Darwinian understanding of consciousness fails in two ways. One is it doesn't explain how consciousness could emerge out of insentient or unconscious material. And secondly, it doesn't give us a really good example, a good account of what consciousness brings to the party that basically good mechanisms wouldn't do better. Think of all the mechanisms your body is running at the moment. They're doing a jolly good job. If you or I had to run our body for 10 seconds, it'd be a pretty grim thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Certainly. Well, I mean, it definitely sounds like consciousness from an evolutionary advantage point of view certainly seems like a very bad choice that evolution has made. Um, but there's also the idea that agency, for example, becomes possible only with consciousness. So from that point of view, isn't it an evolutionary advantage?
What a good question. But you might say, well, you only need agency because mechanism fails. You only need to do things to survive if the survival mechanisms aren't as good as they should be. So in that sense, if I were you, I'd go for a better mechanism. And of
Yeah.
course, if you think about it, what evolution has done has to produce fantastic mechanisms. I mean, consciousness is quite a late entry into the world.
Yeah.
If I was a psychist, I wouldn't agree with that. But for most of us, the kind of consciousness that we understand in agency is pretty recent development. And most of the benefits of agency and of shared and joined agency have really come incredibly recently. Let's imagine, say, modern humanity was essentially appeared 200,000 years ago. Well, that's just an eye blink in the 4 billion year history of life. No. So essentially, it's bringing us benefits now. My gosh, so much so we're destroying the planet. But we are incredibly potent now. But that's a recent development.
Yeah. There's, I guess, there's one more way of putting this. When you speak about the difference between a brain and a person,
Yes.
brain basically the material brain, uh, it belongs to this. It belongs to the realm of actualities, whereas a person, has this realm, this access to possibilities. So in that
Oh,
sense,
brilliant. Yeah,
in that sense, I mean, consciousness, I mean, that again, I
yeah,
mean, it opens a lot of possibilities for
absolutely.
adaptation and evolutionary advantage. Isn't
Oh, I
that?
see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, and I agree with you. And the fact that we have free will and agency, and perhaps we'll come to talk about that genuine agency, um, is because we can actually imagine possibilities, and we'll again perhaps talk about possibilities. And of course, people have argued, for example, that vision allows you to see um, things in advance. So if an animal's got vision, it can see the predator long before the predator is perhaps sinking its teeth into its side. But actually, again, that's making the best of a bad job. Why did the mechanism ever get in such a position to be so vulnerable? So I think that's something that that Darwinism doesn't seem to answer.
What do you think would be an alternative explanation? if these explanations fail at this point?
The trouble is, I don't have an alternative explanation, and it's much worse than that. Not only do I not have an alternative explanation, as it were, ontological, but I'm not even sure what ontology I support. For example, a lot of people have often heard me speaking and think I believe the mind is a kind of Cartesian stuff that's totally separate from the physical body, including the physical brain. I certainly don't agree with that at all. And so often people feel that I'm actually effectively a Cartesian, that I'm embracing a bankrupt notion of basically Cartesian dualism, in which there are two substances, the mind and the body. I'm not a Cartesian dualist. I'm not even a property dualist. I don't think that mind and body are two aspects of the same fundamental stuff. I'm not an idealist. I don't think the world consists essentially of basically essentially mental stuff. I'm not a panpsychist. So I'm an ontological agnostic. I don't think we have yet got round to thinking properly about whether there's one stuff or two stuffs, or whether it's right to think about just a handful of stuffs, one, two, or three, or whatever. So I'm certainly, I don't have an explanation, but even less, I don't, or even worse, I don't quite know what it is we yet have to explain.
Yeah.
I don't think we've formulated the question properly or formulated the challenge. No. But at least I have an insight. There's a lovely quote from Gertrude Stein, who when when she was taken into hospital, I think for her last operation, and she said, "Well, what is the answer?" Thinking this is her last days were coming, and there was no answer. So she said, "Okay, what's the question?" And I think we're still at the stage of what's the question? How are we going to formulate good questions in this respect?
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the way, we won't formulate them so long as we embrace outdated
Yeah.
neurological materialism. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not peddling a spiritual belief either. I mean, I don't have any strong spiritual beliefs, and perhaps we can talk about humanism in
Yes,
due course.
certainly, certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean that is like one of the differential diagnoses. I mean, if you don't, accept
Excellent.
naturalism, I mean, are you saying that there's such a thing as a soul, for example? I mean, that's something we could explore.
Yeah.
But before going there, I mean, for all the list of alternatives that you've just given, certainly ontological agnosticism seems like one of the most elegant options that one could adopt. I mean, at the present moment.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yes. You may think it's a bit lazy, but in a way,
No,
uh, uh, I think it was John Locke who once said, basically, he saw himself full undergardener, removing the rubbish on the path to the kind of truths that the incomparable Mr. Newton would discover. So if I have a humble undergardener's role of cleaning the rubbish on the path to truth, I'll settle for that. Although I'd like to have a little bit more before I die, know a little bit more, because I'm quite curious, as to what business I've been in for the last 73 years.
oh yeah. Oh, this also reminds me of just yesterday I had read your essay on Wittgenstein's uncertainty,
Oh, yes, yes.
and that is also about I mean until the end of his life he was after these questions, and I mean
Yeah.
about finding the beginning, and that's something we can return to again at the end.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly his last diary entries are very moving, but perhaps again we can return to them.
Yeah.
Yes. You were sort of flagging up whether I believe in the soul or not.
Oh yeah.
It seems to me, if I said I believe in the soul, I wouldn't know what I was taking on board, because it's a term with a lot of historical baggage.
Yeah.
Some souls are immortal. Some souls are basically passed from body to body. Some souls are manufactured by hand, by God, and so on and so forth. There are many ways of understanding the soul. I do believe in the self, and I believe that the self is much more than the kind of reduced self of a succession of experiences. The self is something, not a substance, but it's something quite substantial. So I believe in the self. Whether or not I think it amounts to a soul, I'm very dubious because of the very heavy historical baggage the concept of soul has. Yeah.
Certainly. And I suppose one chief distinction between the self and the soul is the soul can be conceived as a disembodied entity as well, but
Yes,
we can only
exactly.
conceive of our personhood or ourself as a. I mean, the brain, even though although it's not a sufficient condition, it's certainly a necessary condition of our personhood.
It is. Yes. But certainly you're quite right. The idea that the soul could, obviously in some very interesting religions, the soul does occupy a succession of bodies, and not necessarily a succession of human bodies. It may be a succession of other animal bodies. But
Yeah.
it's strange to think. I mean, when we think of the soul as a kind of substance, then we do run into the problem that Descartes identified very early on. Of the soul by definition is not extended in space. In the how does it therefore intersect with a body that is extended in space?
Yeah.
How does the body entrap the soul? I mean, my own feeling is I talk about an embodied subject, which is a term taken from philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but I prefer the phrase, my own manufactured way, which is an embodied subject, that I am this thing. But the way in which I am it is not just, as it were, I am a piece of meat. My relationship to is not to a piece of meat. It is to something that I first person am, which is quite a difficult and slippery concept.
Yeah. And the idea of I mean, even in your other works, you the kind of philosophical anthropology that you present, in which our embodied or corporal or physiological existence is should be seen, kept at the center of looking at who we are, uh, and
And you won't be surprised. I mean, as a doctor, I can't ignore the body. Neither can you. We can't, can we, as doctors? I mean, the body is front and central. And it seems to me that it's worthwhile thinking, though, all the strange relationships we have to our bodies. In a sense, we am them. In a sense, that we know them as objects. In the sense that we utilize them as tools. Sometimes I deliberately use my uh, hand as a tool by shading myself from the sun. I possess my body, and it's mine. Don't you touch me, and I have a right over its disposal. So we have a set of very complicated relationships to our bodies, and even a knowledge relationship. I mean, you and I know more about our bodies than the general public does, but nonetheless, it is a strange relationship to have. Um, and also, there is the feeling, although I am my body, I don't colonize it completely. I haven't had a conversation with my kidneys ever. As for my spleen, if I hadn't told I had one, I wouldn't even know it existed. I sort of only superficially colonized my body. So, although I am my body in one sense, I'm distant from it in other ways. Um, and that kind of relationship is a really, really interesting one. I've written a lot about the hand
yeah,
because I see it as basically one of the major sources of the difference between human beings and other animals, including our nearest primate kin. I mean, that's a massively unoriginal thought. I mean, it began with Anaximander, and many other philosophers have talked about this. Kant said the hand is the window onto the mind. But our relationship to our hand is extraordinary for all sorts of reasons. Should I go on a little bit about that? Or are you happy if I just talk a little bit about the hand?
uh,
Yeah,
before we actually talk about the hand in more detail, I mean,
yes,
I just want to touch upon something you were mentioning right now,
of course, yes,
the fact of our embodied or our bodily existence, as as really central to the kind of philosophical anthropology that we have, or a philosophical understanding of who we are. uh, I w- I mean, I had come across the work of this Scottish moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. I
oh,
think
yes,
you
yes,
might be aware.
yes,
So I mean,
yes.
one of the books is termed "Dependent Rational Animals,"
I
and
hadn't heard that, but that's a really good phrase. Yes,
oh,
yes,
yeah.
I haven't. Yeah.
All right, so this is one of his later. It was a series of lectures that he had given, and it's composed into a book now. The Basically he takes to task, I mean, virtually the entire history of Western moral philosophy for neglecting the bodily or the embodied or the dependent and vulnerable uh, aspect of our existence. I mean,
Yes,
his charge is that Western moral philosophy talks, I mean, deals with the human subject as if it were almost a disembodied mind, I suppose, in many ways.
yes, yes.
I mean,
Gosh,
yeah,
I'm truly sympathetic to that, because I mean, if I didn't know it already, my years as a doctor made me realize to what extent we are utterly interdependent. There's a lovely phrase from Jan Patočka, a Czech philosopher who was effectively murdered by the secret police. I'm very touched by something that Jan Patočka said. He was a phenomenologist, but he felt that most phenomenologists didn't emphasize the body enough. Merleau-Ponty did, but Heidegger didn't really sufficiently. And he said, you mustn't forget, we're all born in someone's arms. And that mutual, profound dependency is something that has been underrated in certainly a lot of Western philosophy, which very much individualizes people and sees them as almost isolated points of view. So I hadn't heard of what you said about Alistair MacIntyre, but I'm deeply sympathetic to it, I must say. Yeah.
yeah. There's one more aspect which I'd also come across this book by Javi Carrel on the phenomenology of illness, and I'd seen that you had also recommended that book.
Yes.
Um, uh, in one of her essays, the title of the chapter is Conspicuous, Obstinate, and Obtrusive. So this is basically the phenomenology of illness. I mean, when you are ill and when you are deprived of your normal bodily functions, your
Yes.
embodied existence becomes much more conspicuous, and you become much more aware of
Yes.
your body at that point. Um, and there's this kind of humanistic or a kind of spiritual, I suppose, lesson to be taken from that as well, or something of that value. I see it. Uh,
Absolutely.
when we are deprived sorry, I just complete this point and then you can. I mean, the idea is basically that when you're deprived of a certain thing, you get to appreciate. I mean, you tend to appreciate it more, or at least what you have. You tend, I mean, gratitude tends to uh, be encouraged by deprivation, I suppose. I mean,
Yes. I think that's very true. It's like I used to say to when patients are in a wheelchair, I said, you are not dependent on the rest of us. Your dependency is just more obvious than my dependency. We're all utterly dependent from our body outwards. And I couldn't agree with you more. And Javi is very good on how obtrusive. And when the body starts to fail, it starts becoming the story. You know, I don't want to make breathing my day's work. I don't want to make breathing the biggest thing that's happening to me as I'm gasping for breath. I want breathing to be in the background while I get on with other things. And slowly but surely, you feel as if, as you decay and get older, your body starts closing over you. But Javi's written beautifully, as you say, from a phenomenological point of view, from her own experience of a very rare respiratory problem. I can't remember its name. It had some complex acronym, but yeah.
sorry, I had interrupted you. You were speaking about your book on the hand.
Ah, the hand. Yes, and in a sense, it's a part of the exploration of embodiment. And one of the great puzzles is, okay, Tallis, you think human beings are really terrifically different from primates, other primates, and that's why you feel that human persons cannot be understood as organisms in the way that perhaps chimpanzees can be understood as organisms. So how did they get to be so different? And it seems to be it's never a sudden process. I mean, in the book on the hand, I trace it 5.5 million years, not from personal recollection, I hasten to add, I'm not that old. And basically, it seems to be 5.5 million years ago, several things happened. But the most important was that because of climatic change, uh, one lot of primates, that's the hominins, which is us, moved from the jungle out to the open savanna. And suddenly, two things became important. Vision became much more important, and the upright position was assumed to give vision much greater advantage. And that had a major impact on the role of the forelimb. Uh, Sherrington, the great neurophysiologist, expressed it beautifully when he said that the hand ceased to be a sort of poor locomotive prop and became a delicate explorer of space and expression. As a result of that, also, or at least there was one other important change, which was unlike all the other primates, we have a totally opposable thumb, which gives a fantastic additional dexterity to our hand. And it seems to me, and I'm not in any way original in this, that the hand then becomes the prototype of a tool. It's the tool of tools, as Aristotle said. But that gives us a sense of agency that's quite different from the sense of agency that other primates have. A sense that indeed we are doing the things that we are doing because we have this proximal tool, our hands, which gives us a sense of agency. There's other aspects of the hand as well, which Husserl and people like that have talked about, which is, for example, quite much what I do with my hand is it's the hand talking to the hand. There's a kind of higher level handedness, as it were, within our very complicated hands, because we have a capacity for fractionated finger movement in a way that's not seen in other primates. And we also have a capacity to separate our index finger from the other fingers, which connects with our use of gestures, in particular pointing. So that's really how we became to be so different. So you can be a good Darwinian, seeing how the human organism came about, but you can reject Darwinitis by saying, well, hang on, but something happened a long time ago, and we started forking off from all the other primates. So we're fundamentally different. And one measure of how different we are is how little this cultural evolution there has been in primates. You know, what's the greatest technological achievement of a primate 500,000 years ago? Well, to smash basically a nut with a stone. What's the great technological achievement of a chimpanzee now? Same again, just to smash a nut with a stone. In the meantime, we have utterly transformed the conditions of our life, and at a rate which is getting faster and faster. So there you are. That's my, as it were, Darwinism without Darwinitis, and a recognition that we are fundamentally different, and that's important to me as a humanist.
Yeah, certainly. From the point of view of humanism itself, this seems very important. That I mean, that there is the idea that there is something special about human beings,
Yeah,
because you also, I mean, in aping mankind, early in the beginning, you uh, mention John Gray, a famous
yeah,
uh, his idea of man is basically like any other animal, and I suppose directly from that what ensues is a very bleak picture of or a very pessimistic view of life itself,
yeah,
of human beings.
yeah, very much so. Yes, I mean, John Gray is interesting. I mean, he began as quite optimistic and a liberal and so on and so forth, but he has become a pessimist, and he's really got his international fame from his pessimism. I wrote an article about him about a year or so ago called 50 Shades of Black, the malignant pessimism of John Gray, because he is profoundly pessimistic. He describes basically human beings as Homo sapiens, is his account of human beings, and thinks that we are vain in thinking that we are any different from other animals. We are vain to think that we can be explained in any other terms than than Darwinism. And actually, he does that by appealing to Darwinism. He said, Darwin has shown us that the mind is not an organ of truth, but of survival. And I say, well, hang on a moment. Is that true, what Darwin said? In which case, basically, Darwin has revealed some truths, objective truths. But you say there's no such thing as objective truth. There's only those things that serve our survival. So he contradicts himself. It's a bit like the Theban liar who says, you know, everybody from Thebes is lying, including me. And you know that you get into a problem there. But I mean, there is a corrective to a cheerful, cruel, Panglossian liberalism. You know, we know the world is a cruel place. We know that progress isn't guaranteed. But actually, progress does take place. I don't know if you've ever read Hans Rosling's Factfulness,
Oh
which
yeah.
looks it's an absolutely brilliant book, and it looks at the objective measures of progress over the last 50 years in terms of life expectancy, child mortality, female education, malnutrition, etc. There is a long, long way to go, but gosh, how far we have gone. And the danger of someone like John Gray is twofold. One is that people would just give up and say, oh, well, you know, let's just cultivate our garden and let everybody rot all around us. The alternative is say, well, we've tried progressive improvement. Now we need a big revolution. And we know where revolutions take us. So I think he's potentially a dangerous thinker as well as a muddle-headed thinker. Yeah. And because he's anti-humanist, and summarizing my humanist position, it is to say that I do not subscribe to any particular religion. I don't, basically, I haven't had the experience of religious experiences, and I'm worried about what religion brings to the world. Not all religions, but some religions. And so I don't have religious belief. I don't have a supernatural account of humanity, that we were specially handmade by God, as it were. But that doesn't mean to say that I'm obliged to have a purely naturalistic account, which makes us just a piece of nature. I would describe my viewpoint as a humanist as being that human beings are extra natural, outside of nature, but not above it, and not dissolved into it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. The idea that, well, I mean, on the one hand, you have naturalism, on the other, you have supernaturalism. But
Yes.
I'm unable to see what middle ground could be taken. I mean, what exactly does extra natural mean? For example, what I mean by default, whatever is not natural, it seems to I mean invite something for I mean some kind of um, some explanatory tool basically that goes beyond the merely material world, or the merely natural world. So I mean, are you, I mean, what kind of a middle position can be taken over there?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really brilliant question. And in a sense, trying to define that middle position, I would say, is pretty well been the whole of my life's writing work in that sense. Um, First of all, the answer won't be an ontological one. It won't be said, oh, we're made of mind or we're made of spirits or whatever. It'll be a descriptive one. And one way of actually defining and describing in the sense in which we're extra natural is to actually look at humanity in the way that I have done, to look at uh, what it is to be a knowing animal, what our relationships are to our bodies, what our relationships are to each other, what society is composed of, that goes way beyond herd behavior, and so on and so forth. What does language do? In what sense we are explicit animals? You referred to that book. So it's very much a descriptive enterprise. But it's still, I think, and you're quite right, leaves one hungry for something that's going to gather everything up. And for me, what gathers everything up is the um, naturalistically unexplained or materially unexplained emergence of consciousness, um, and of the subject in a previously or prior subjectless world. I mean, that certainly cannot be explained. And it's the emergence of a viewpoint, a first person viewpoint, it seems to me, is the marker and origin of transcendence of the natural world, without that transcendence having to be underwritten by God and spirits and so on and so forth. But it's a description, if you like, of what is the case, how we are distant from nature. I mean, what we're doing for the moment, nothing could be more distant from nature from what we're doing at the moment. It may have some remote connection with our basic physiological needs, but gosh, so remote that it's really probably not connected at all. The question you asked is a really important one. Do you feel that answer is satisfactory, or do you want to press me a bit more?
um, I mean, this is really interesting. I'd like to really press you more on this because,
Yes.
well, you affirm transcendence, or that there is something beyond. Um, and I suppose another position could be taken that, for example, I mean, from how I see it, um, I can say that I don't have to necessarily subscribe to a very caricature idea of a god, for example, as someone's sitting in the sky, but as basically the for example the Paul Tillichen idea of the ground of being, or which is not basically not something entirely a distinct entity apart from creation or apart from everything else.
Yeah.
Um, so I suppose what you are saying, I mean, certainly this is my impression that what I also find fascinating in your work is that there are hints of transcendence. I mean, there are not just hints. I mean, there are, very obvious
Mm.
pointers towards this transcendence, or this kind of aspect of our existence, which I mean, can you? I don't see it as like those kind of binary options. You either have to subscribe to a very caricature idea of a god. I mean, is there a more nuanced position also that you can take, or that one can take? Sorry.
Yes, I'm very aware of the much more nuanced ideas. God is not a
Yeah.
man in the sky and all that sort of stuff. And I'm part of a group called Religion and Atheism, where we debate with bishops and other people who have religious beliefs. It seems to me that when I'm trying to define the transcendence, I do what Wittgenstein said philosophers should do, which is to assemble reminders for a purpose. So let's look at, for example, our relationship to our hand, how complicated it gets. For example, we use our digits ultimately as the primordial source of counting. We use our arms as the primordial source of measurement. Suddenly, on the basis of counting and measurement, we create this massive cognitive structure, ultimately called science, which in fact we can turn back on our bodies and use it to measure them for all sorts of reasons we do in physiology. But that to me is an example of a transcendent journey in which we transcend our own bodies and we stand outside of them and we see them, as it were, through a generalizing viewpoint. So that's one example of transcendence. So all the transcendence that I would want to, as it were, persuade you of is transcendence that you can see when you're invited to look at it. And when you talk about the ground of being, that is almost by definition something that's invisible, something that has to be taken on trust, something you might feel very strongly, of course. But all I can say is, look, what I have to offer you in my humanism is things that are so straightforward that you wouldn't even dream of denying them. But they're now, by looking at them carefully, they're invested with wonder and astonishment. So I can be amazed that we human beings used our bodies to create units called qubits, which then were used to measure this and measure that, and ultimately became the basis of architecture and so on. That to me is the kind of transcendence which involves joined intentionality and so on, that I would say, look about you, you will see it, rather than there's a transcendence that's sort of hidden away. Who
Oh,
knows,
yeah.
when I might discover there was things hidden away. But at the moment, I'm sort of satisfied, apart from the fact that I die, which I'm not at all satisfied about. But that this is the kind of transcendence that, as it were, no one could quarrel with. They just need it to be unpacked for them.
Yeah, certainly. Uh, and that idea of transcendence is something that, I mean, even to me, it seems much more reasonable than, for example, I mean, now when you're saying it, the ground of being sounds like a really grand theory. Um,
Yeah.
but what I would certainly be what I would find more relatable is basically pockets of transcendence that you can find in different aspects of your existence. Um, um, and well, uh, transcendence itself uh, could also be seen as the flip side of immanence, or the presence of the beyond within the mundane. Um, and I mean, those examples which you cite, of the hand, or of joined intentionality even, and language, and I mean, all of these things, and just the mere the sheer fact of existence itself, of course,
Yeah,
the wonder.
absolutely. Yes. And that is certainly, I mean, to be astonished at that one is, and to be
Yeah,
disappointed one is for such a short time. Basically, they are, as it were, big ideas that, as it were, underlight one's specific observations of those ways in which we are transcendent. And transcendence is everywhere if you look for it. I mean, I've got an essay called "On Being Thanked by a Paper Bag," and when you get a paper bag, it says, "Thank you for shopping in this shop." And you think, how on earth did we get to this place where a paper bag is thanking me? And you can then trace it all the way back of the distance that we've traveled to get at that point. So, but
yeah,
I'm sort of sympathetic to what you're saying, because the one thing that as it were, my humanist embrace of transcendence doesn't address is mortality. That is to say, there's no comfort in it when you think about the fact we will lose everything, that every one of us loses everything. And that's where there is no comfort. And so, but on the other hand, I'm not sure how much comfort the ground of being would give me, unless it was sort of my particular ground of my particular being, so it is, and it's interesting you mentioned the ground of being, because the kind of transcendence that I'm recommending and the ground of being you're talking about aren't the kind of things that lead people to burn each other's villages to the ground over dispute. And I think one always wants to make sure that transcendence remains innocent of, doesn't drive all sorts of transcendental angers or transcendentally warranted angers. And that's, I think, one of the challenges for humanism, because in a church, I've always been impressed that people's deepest thoughts are had in common, whereas we philosophers and humanists have our deepest thoughts alone. But there is always a danger when you do, as it were, bring the deep thoughts together in a community. There's then potential conflict with people who have other deep thoughts. And so I think there's this, I mean, you do get a situation where you're burning each other's villages and so on and so forth.
So there's just, I just feel like there's just so much that we've left out. There's so much we could have spoken about, and there's with your work in, but we've also spoken about quite a lot as well.
Yes.
And yeah, you're mentioning about mortality. I think that's a good way to the conversation right now.
Yes.
And I don't want to belabor this discussion that we're having about humanism and religion, even though that's quite fascinating. I just want to mention in passing that the idea of mortality in the face of absolute nothingness that follows after death, that certainly seems more comfortable to me, rather than, if I think about uh, and a very uncertain kind of idea of what has to come afterwards. I mean, that brings its own anxiety over there. So I'm much more
Very much
comfortable
so.
thinking, yeah.
I'm totally like you. I cannot think of one version of eternity that's attractive. Let's think of, for example, if I'm resurrected in my flesh, it's very difficult to know who else will be resurrected with me. And otherwise, if it's only me, it's a jolly lonely place. But if
Yeah.
I'm resurrected without my flesh, basically, I will have no location in space or time. I'll have no agenda. But let's supposing I am resurrected in the flesh and I live forever. I will change forever. So eventually I will have changed so much that there's absolutely no resemblance between me, who was basically the star player at my funeral, and essentially me in 10,000 years' time. So either
Yeah.
if nothing happens in eternity, that's pretty unbearable. If
Yeah.
something happens at a finite rate, I'm going to be utterly changed out of all recognition. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's no attractive eternity.
This also reminds me of that short story by Borges, George Louis Borges, The Immortal. If you're familiar with that, I mean that.
I'm familiar with Borges, but I've forgotten that story. Just remind me.
All
Yeah.
right. So the idea is that someone who lives out, I mean, who is an immortal and who lives for eternity, for an infinite span of time, that person has lived out every possible permutation of life that was possible. So his own identity gets dissolved or gets diffused into the whole thing.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
we are
Yes.
only
Yeah.
who we are because we are a particular kind of person. We have a particular kind of history or contingent, trajectory.
Exactly.
When you are everything, then you are nothing at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, being a self is being other to all other possibilities. And I think it's, and we obviously have a great attraction to ourselves to continue roughly being the same thing. Obviously, not only roughly being the same thing, because we love the idea of development, we love the idea of change, we love the idea of novelty, and we want to have a story that unfolds. I mean, one of the great things about writing is you always have a story that unfolds. You've always got a book on the go, which connects days with each other. But
Oh, yeah.
I mean, seems to be there is no attractive eternity. And even if you're not worried about eternity of being an eternity of punishment, which obviously is a great worry for some. But it's difficult to imagine eternal existence. The trouble is, I don't want to stop now. I mean, a lot of people are sick of Raymond Tallis, but I can't get enough of him, So okay, I know I've got to die sometime, but not today or tomorrow or next week, or indeed, not before certain things have happened. The grandchildren got their GCSEs or whatever,
Yeah.
We're very difficult. It's very difficult to imagine a happy outcome in that sense. And that's why, I guess, for many religions, eternity isn't specified. I mean, many don't have eternity, but it isn't specified because there isn't an attractive eternity.
I think this is a good way to end the conversation.
That was a rather glum ending, wasn't it?
Podcast. Yeah.
Oh.
But before we sign off, I just want to ask you a few personal questions, and I'm going to edit this out of the interview.
Of course.
I mean, I've always been conflicted between medicine and philosophy, and that I see in your own case, you've been quite comfortable with the combination of both of them. For me, it's always been like an either or kind of choice, and
Yeah.
I also considered dropping out of medicine for the reason of pursuing philosophy, but then that wasn't encouraged in the kind of setting where I am in. But I mean, there's this interesting line that I read in Oliver Sacks' autobiography. He talks about his own student days, and Jonathan Miller was one of his classmates as well. So Jonathan Miller is writing to Oliver Sacks. I mean, upon getting that was the first time he was getting into a research project in physiology. But he mentioned that our love of science is purely literary, and I feel I'm afraid that's the case in my own case as well.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true. I mean, yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of drudgery in science. I mean, obviously, I did a lot of research. I ran a department looking at stroke rehabilitation, epilepsy, and so on. There's a lot of drudgery. It's a very good question you ask, but I actually find it difficult to be a philosopher and a medic simultaneously. I mean, basically, I would do my philosophy in the morning and then set off, and it was a 20-minute drive to the hospital. And by the time I'd arrived at the hospital, I'd ceased to be a philosopher and become a medic. Because you can't ask those fundamental questions. If somebody says cardiac arrest, ward 7, you can't say, "Oh, what do we mean by ward 7? And is there really an outside world where there's people having..." So, alas, there isn't a point of convergence. We are irreducibly multiple. I mean, you'll find there's another dimension, multiplicity, when you have children. They matter fantastically. And so there's a third dimension. Kierkegaard once said, purity of heart is to will one thing. And I would like to believe there was a vanishing point where all one's ambitions and hopes came to a single point. But I think one can't help but be more than one. And for me, there wasn't much crossover between philosophy and medicine. Not even when I thought about medical ethics, because obviously we have lots of ethical problems. But I didn't feel that I would need to appeal to philosophy to solve them, because I don't think philosophy offered me solutions. You could say there's a utilitarian response, there's a deontic response, and there's a this, that, and the other. But you say, but 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I've got to make a decision. Plato, you've been on the case for 2,500 years. Can you give us some hint? So in that sense, I sort of come to terms with the fact that one is necessarily multiple. I know that's not a very cheerful answer, is it? But it's sort of...
That is... it seems like there's always going to be this trade-off. And I mean, for example, one of the very daunting aspects of a medical career is also that I find that it is something that tends to be all-consuming.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And if you have intellectual ambitions, or if you have this kind of literary ambitions, and I suppose speaking of ambition, I really enjoyed your poem Ambition.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh dear, yes. Well, thank you for that. And in many ways, that's slightly autobiographical, but in a way, I mean, you're absolutely right. But there are periods when I wrote very little, perhaps several years. I've always kept a diary and a notebook. I mean, your notebook is absolutely essential, so that whatever you're doing, even if you don't do anything with the notes, accumulating and so on. But there are periods when I got utterly consumed with medicine. I mean, the responsibilities of medicine are all consuming, aren't they? I mean, people never seem to realize, people talk about the unbearable lightness of being. There's also the unbearable heaviness of responsibility. If you think you've screwed up a patient, it is utterly and we do. You will make some mistakes that are awful, and you'll regret them, but everybody does. And so, in a sense, medicine is the most engrossing profession. I think it's more engrossing even than the law or whatever. Never mind usual jobs. So, I guess you've got to trust yourself to know that you'll have periods when you won't be a philosopher. You'll have periods when you'll have one line of notes in your notebook in 6 weeks, or no lines, and you haven't read a philosophy book for a while. I think that's, you've got to trust you don't get knocked down by a bus, of course, before before you then come back to it. But it's so, and the alternative to being a professional philosopher, and I think that has got real problems. I'm on something called the REF at the moment, Research Excellence Framework, in which philosophy departments declare their research output and they get marked for it and so on. It's a complicated business. And I thought that really is reducing philosophy. To go from wonder to counting brownie points, is sort of doesn't quite, So I don't think there's a way of being a professional philosopher would give you more freedom. In many ways, it could reduce the value of philosophy.
Yeah. And one last question: do you think of course, I mean, how do you think your experience as a physician, for example, seeing patients on a daily basis, and I mean that kind of a view of humanity, of seeing that, I, I imagine it can be truly rewarding in terms of your own moral education or your own character formation. I mean, these are maybe not strictly philosophical gains that you get, but you certainly your vision of life becomes much more enriched by this experience, I'm sure.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. There were people whom I saw who put up with things, illness and so on, deprivation. I worked in very poor parts of the UK, Salford and Wolverhampton and so on, Liverpool. And, there were people who coped with things that I couldn't cope with. So it's certainly, my view of humanity is a very positive one. And yet, I don't know how many patients I would have seen in my 37-year career, but probably ran into hundreds of thousands. None of them were living the examined life along the Plato's sense, partly because life was examining them in the way that Plato's life wasn't examining him. But they were truly admirable, solid people from whom I learned a lot. And likewise, my colleagues, none of whom really were there's only one who was interested in philosophy, seriously interested in philosophy. But, they were admirable people who were, and I mean, there is nothing like medicine, is there? The combination of science, theatre, and the hope of doing good. I mean, it's a pretty unbeatable combination, really, isn't it? I mean, we have drama and, as I say, the science and the hope of doing good. And every now and then one does by accident.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Tallis, for your time again. Thank you. I mean, it's been truly a really enjoyable.
It's been a pleasure, Saad. Well, you've been a fantastic interlocutor. You're going to make a good doctor. Or you are a good doctor.
I hope. Thank you.
Because you're good at asking questions. Yeah.